Welcome to the Sanctum Secorum and a special live episode. Today we are deeply honored to be joined by the author Michael Moorcock. Mr. Moorcock is the creator of Elric, Hawkmoon, Jerry Cornelius, and a number of other beloved fantasy and science fiction creations. December will see the release of his newest novel in the Elric saga, The Citadel of Forgotten Myths. So let me start by introducing our guest of honor, and then I will catch you up with the keepers. Hello, Mr. Moorcock.
Hi, how are you?
Doing very well.
Good. I hope everybody out there's having a good time.
I'm Keeper Bob, and with me, as always, is Keeper Mark, Keeper Jen.
Hello, everyone.
And returning is Keeper Dave.
Hey everybody, good to be back. Thanks for letting me join this special show.
Yeah, with a show like this, we had to bring the whole team in.
It sounds like I'm a particularly mean wild animal. You need 3 keepers to deal with.
You've met Bob, I see.
It's one of those things we just need to be prepared for all emergencies, Mike.
Right,
all
right.
emergencies.
I should be all right as long as I keep drinking this special drink.
So,
what was that your wife called it? Swamp juice?
Swamp juice. It's a what's it called? Liquid IV, and it's really just a fast.
I didn't mean to pry it.
No,
the name of it. The name of it is what
I'd recommend
tickled
it to
me.
everybody. It's not that bad. It doesn't taste that bad. And either that or I've got used to it. But it's just for rehydrating. I mean, it's nothing, for hydrating, just for keeping hydrated. And it's just a kind of super hydration drink. I don't know how they can get more water into water, but there you go. They've found a way of selling it to us.
sure, wet water. Well, Mike, it has been over 60 years since the debut of Elric, and now we have the new book, The Citadel of Forgotten Myths. What can you tell us about this latest entry into the Elric saga?
Well, it's closer to some of the earlier books than the later ones. It's a straightforward Elric, beginning, middle, and end adventure. It's probably, from what people who've seen a bit of it ahead of time, think that that in certain sections Elric might be a bit more mature and philosophical, but the adventures, apparently, people find those just as good. So I haven't had a bad response yet, but that's not to say I won't have. But so far so good. I mean, it really just takes Elric. It takes a point before. After Elric meets Zarazinia in, I think, the first book, or the first written book, he then there's a gap before they actually settle down and Stormbringer starts. So it's written just before the beginning of Stormbringer, and Elric leaves Zarazinia she says, in fact, basically, get out of the house, you're driving me crazy, go and have another adventure. So he does. And it's really an adventure in which he's sort of seeking the roots of further seeking, really, but in more detail, the roots of the Melnibonéan people and of their dragon, whatever you call them, their dragon brothers and sisters, and it explains more of what the Faun, who are the dragons, and the Melnibonéans have in common, and how they came about, and so on. It's sort of background story, but it's mostly adventure. I mean, it doesn't go into huge, to my mind, boring details. It just.
I don't think any of the books could be described as boring.
Well, I mean, that's because I'm trying not to make them boring. But and I'm hoping that this one is a bit more mature in some ways, because I'm 82. I mean, I'm not the same person entirely that I was when I was 20 20 when I did the first one. So obviously, I've got a few more thoughts, and Elric probably sounds slightly more mature than he does in the next book, but I can't really do much about that. I try to keep that to a minimum and keep the dragons and marvels and nasty swords to a maximum.
You had said at one point that Elric sort of represented like angsty late adolescence, so he's
Yes, well, that's the
he's
problem.
growing up a bit.
Exactly, it's the problem you have, when you start that young. The only person I know who really did it successfully in a series was Marjorie Allingham in her Gerald Campion, her Alfred Campion series of detective stories, where he matured and she matured at the same time. So the later books are in fact far, far deeper and better than the early books, which are still pretty good. But she had him growing up, and becoming older and older through the series, which made more sense for her. She could actually, she could have him not quite the idiot that he was when he first began, which he was. Anyway, yeah, so it's difficult when you're dodging around like this, but that's the Eternal Champion anyway. You're bringing in different themes, different stories all the time, and you're carrying it on relatively few characters, and you obviously can't do much about being older. But what you have to try to do is just remember technically, in the technical writing of the book, to keep it fast, and keep it all interesting to people.
Mike, I have a
Oh, it's
question.
the cat. I heard this heavy breathing in the corner of the room, and it's the cat. she's come in as an observer. We might need that extra keeper. I'll give her some of my swamp juice in a minute. That'll calm her down.
I have a question for you. How do you feel that from the first story about Elric to where you are now, how do you feel you've changed as an author? Has your style changed, or has your process, has it changed any at all from point A to point B?
Well, I'm a much slower writer now, so I guess I'm slightly more contemplative. But I think I'm still basically, I still identify with Elric. I mean, I'm not like Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. Couldn't stand Sherlock Holmes at the end and was just doing it because of the demand. I actually enjoy adding to, well, the different cycles of the Eternal Champion, but particularly Elric. I mean, he's still somebody I can identify with. And understand, of course, but I understand him a bit better now than he understands himself, which you have to sort of pull back on a little bit and show it in terms of action and certain responses rather than simple editing or whatever. I mean, it's not that difficult because I like the character so much. I think if I was doing this cynically, which I wouldn't do anyway, because I don't have to and I don't want to, I'd probably simplify them a little bit, but not a huge amount. There's a patch in the new book which is, if you like, a slowing down patch, which is meant, I mean, it's a journey, and it's meant to have this sort of little bit in the middle. I hate to say this, but it's at 82 I probably can. I'm a very good technician, and I know how to make books work technically, if you know what I mean. I mean, I can, and these were done. The first ones were done very early in my career, although I still had a lot of experience because I'd done a lot of comics before that. And comics give you a very good discipline. I think particularly the English weeklies gave you a particularly good discipline in storytelling, in producing the right dramatic moments, and the right way of keeping the reader interesting, and the right way of ending something so the reader feels satisfied. And I have from all the responses I've had, people say they're satisfied. So that's all I can say, really. I never know how my books are going to be received. I got a great review. Actually, it's an old review. Somebody sent me the other day, or put on Facebook the other day, which refers to one of my recent books as, I think, meandering drivel. And more than that, I can't remember the rest of it. And as I said at the time, people saying this is it's a horrible, man, this and that. And I said, if you've grown up in the early days of fanzines, people were so much meaner than they are, at least in print, than they used to be, that you don't really take it very, very badly when people say things like that. I mean, I've had far worse said of my stuff by friends in fanzines. So it's, but anyway, that's the other side of the story. I think, well, maybe it is meandering dribble. I actually do take that sort of criticism fairly seriously, probably more than people who like it. I don't know whether that really answers your question, but it's technically how I try to do it. And I
Mike,
also ramble a lot.
Mike, I was going to ask a question because while we're kind of talking about Elric, I had an opportunity to purchase the Saga Press editions that came out, I think this last year, which are omnibus collections,
yeah.
And they have nice forwards by like Neil Gaiman and a few other authors. And one of the things that it caught my attention, I don't know if this is as part of the original stories, but the dedication that's part of the first book, or the kind of synopsis paragraph references inspirations for Elric as like Paul Anderson and Fletcher Pratt. And you also mentioned, for obscure reasons, the Threepenny Opera, and that caught my eye, and I was like, what is the obscure reason? I was kind of curious about,
well,
how did the Threepenny Opera
inspire? I wonder that myself a bit, because again, I'm looking back a long way, and I see that. I think, well, leave it in. I was a great fan of Brecht. Still am, excuse me. I still am. God, I need some more swamp juice. Excuse me. And I think the spirit of the novel, the novel, just caught me. It caught me up. I like the way of seeing the, as it were, the outlaw as the hero, I suppose, on a simple level. That would be it. And I liked a lot of stories like that. I mean, I liked Lee Brackett's, I'm just rereading one now, Lee Brackett's Eric John Stark stories, which were originally in Planet and Thrilling Wonder, and which were thought to be, even as pulps, they were thought to be outside the pale. In those days, I mean, Astounding and Fantasy and Science Fiction were thought to be the posh science fiction magazines. Everything out of that was just space opera and so on. But I love that stuff. I can't get on with Astounding or Fantasy and Science Fiction very easily, but I love Planet stories and Thrilling Wonder and Startling, which in many ways I thought were more innovative and interesting than the more sober science fiction stories. I like Galaxy, actually, when that started to, when Pohl, when Gold's editorship and Pohl's editorship, but Gold in particular was a great editor and did he did The Space Merchants and Stars My Destination, which is the story that got me reading modern science fiction as science fiction. I mean, I was reading science fantasy in Planet and Thrilling Wonder, but I wasn't really reading much straight science fiction. But Galaxy was, it also did a lot of Philip K. Dick and people like that. It was that time, and which is of course still being regurgitated considerably on television. So yeah, I've forgotten your question completely. I warned you I'll ramble, so you can come in with a whip and a chair anytime. I'll stop growling.
No, it's fine. I was just the inspirations for Elric were kind of the general question, and I think what you were reading at the time.
Well, the main of course straight influence on Elric was a detective story or a thriller story character called Zenith the Albino, or Zenith the Albino in American. It's very odd. Anyway, he was a villain in the Sexton Blake Library, which was a pulp series, which I was a sub-editor on for some time, but had been a fan of before that. And I, like many of the readers, it was the villains the very melodramatic villains that I was more interested in than the actual detective. And Zenith was well, he wore an opera cape all the time, which must have been inconvenient because he was also climbing tall buildings a lot of the time too, hat as well. But he had the same kind of cynical attitude to the world. He was an outsider, and so he did attract me. I think basically it's outsiders that attract me. I mean, it's not unusual for writers who already are sort of outsiders to think like that. But yeah, those were the influences. I mean, Anderson was a bit different because I read him. He came out the same year as the first volume of Fellowship of the Rings, and I read him before I read Tolkien. And when I came to read Tolkien after reading The Broken Sword, I was actually very disappointed. It lacked, to me, the epic quality that I'd found in Anderson. It was his second book. He was still very much attached to Norway. I think he was Norwegian, and his family was from there. And I think he was born in Scandinavia. I can't remember. But anyway, he still had a lot of attachment for the place and the locales. And a few years later, as it happened, not because of the book, I also went to that part of Scandinavia and spent a long time there. I was mountain climbing, but I was doing other stuff as well. And the resonances in Anderson are, for me, far closer to the dark resonances of the great, Teutonic, whatever you call them, Norwegian, Scandinavian epics. So I was very satisfied with that, and one or two other books as well. Henry Treece was very good. He was an historical writer though. And I think I could never really get on with Lord of the Rings after that, because I'd got such a strong feeling from the Anderson novel, which he then went and ruined. I mean, well, didn't exactly ruin, but he spoiled it. He rewrote it and cleaned it up, and it lost some of its vigor because it was only the second novel he'd had published. I think he'd been publishing in Planet and Thrilling Wonder and so on before then. But I hadn't read him before then. I mean, I hadn't really found the pulps at that time, 54. I'd only read that. I didn't read anything much except a couple of other things after that, which I really liked too. I didn't like much of his earlier work. I thought it got stultified and sort of generic bound, which happens to a lot of genre writers. They can't really, once they've kind of started in a genre, it's very hard for them to, as it were, overcome the genre habits.
Mentioning genre writers, as we're starting to get some questions in from the chat, and here's a question that I'm certainly curious about. Do you pay much attention to contemporary science fiction and fantasy these days?
No, I never did that much. I'm afraid to say I didn't read. I couldn't read Foundation. I couldn't read any of the great. I couldn't read Dune. I couldn't read any of these sort of well-known science fiction novels of the day, or very many of them. It wasn't until Galaxy started to publish stuff that had a more direct contemporary relevance. Sort of Philip K. Dick came out of Galaxy, essentially. The writers who wrote for Galaxy were all doing the same kind of thing. They were looking at society, they were looking at their own world, and translating it into stories. And I preferred that. I wasn't that interested in. I love science fantasy, Lee Brackett and C.L. Moore and Fritz Leiber did some, and so on. But I just didn't get on with hardcore science fiction at all. So I've completely rambled off the question, I think. Have I?
Well, let's follow that with who do you read?
Well, I read pretty much anything, but I don't read. I don't read detective stories. I like thrillers, but I don't like, and I don't read contemporary thrillers either. I've read very few of those. Walter Mosley is the only detective story writer I really enjoy, and a lot of that is because of the strong grounding in place that his novels have, and time, of course. And so I like him a lot, but I couldn't really tell you, in honesty, another thriller writer or detective story writer that I could, after reading one, I'd want to read another. And that's some good people and good friends of mine too, some of them. So I don't want to, I haven't got any prejudice against them. They just don't interest me.
Well, we've heard that you don't like to read. Let me try that again. We've heard that you don't like to reread your own works either.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm kind of curious how that worked with writing this new novel that fits between two others. Did you actually have to go through and reread something?
No, not really. They're in my head. They are really in my head. Almost all of those. When I've done, sequels to books or trilogies or whatever, it's all in my head. It doesn't seem to go away. I mean, it goes away after a while, but not. Elric doesn't really, because I've been with Elric off and on much more than I've been with any of the other characters, except possibly Von Beck, who's anyway related to Elric. So, but yeah, I mean, what I read actually is, well, as I say, when I'm writing, I read light fiction. That is, I'm rereading Lee Brackett, great space opera stories, whatever you call them. And I think of them as science fantasy stories because they don't have much science in them. They do have a lot of fantasy in them.
That's fair.
And so I, particularly the more further away we get away from Venus and Mars, the more we know what fantasies they are. But or I'll read English pulp thrillers when I'm writing. But when I'm not writing, I tend to read, I suppose you call them predominantly canon classics. I mean, I read Conrad, Henry James, just straight older writers mostly. And I've got a very good library of 18th, 19th century writers. So I don't have to go out. You wouldn't find them much in the local library anyway. But I tend to read as much as anything, and it's a terrible thing to say, for technique as much as anything. I think I'm so much just a writer and not much else, that I read other people's work to see how they've done it. That's part of the curiosity anyway, I think. And probably reading, I read pulp stuff, I think, as much as anything for plot, to remind me about plot and tension, so that I don't go wandering off or meandering off, or whatever the guy said it was I did. I tried to stick to the subject. Depending on the book, I tend to pick. Also, I invent a lot of techniques for specific books. So a book like Mother London, which is not obviously, it's not really part of this conversation, but it's it's a straight novel, call it, is very carefully constructed on a like almost like a 12-tone piece of music, although it's not as unfamiliar in the style. And whereas another series that I did about the Holocaust, or the events leading to the Holocaust, the Piat series, is just one long, like Wagnerian story where leitmotifs start fairly obscurely in the beginning and then grow to larger motifs towards the end, and so on. which is a classical, a truly classical way of putting a book together. But I also use tend to use a lot of musical techniques, which might be partly why I don't read as much as I used to. I don't know, but really I like writing. I get bored very quickly, and I like to have a new book I haven't seen before, and I don't know what's going to happen. I can't guess what's going to happen. And there are a lot of those around. I mean, there are lots of good books around already written. I know that, but if I can't find one, I tend to start thinking of doing another kind of book. I usually have about, I suppose, 5 to 10 stories on the run. Some of them will be novels, and some of them will be novellas, I suppose, and the odd short story.
Well, another question from the viewers: other than Elric, who is your favorite Eternal Champion protagonist to write? You're talking about how you like having that next adventure.
Well, I think Von Beck, I suppose, is the next one, because he's more varied. I can take him to different countries, different times. So I suppose it's Von Beck, from Moorhound of the World's Pain. And if I had any more to say about Hawkmoon, or any more to say about Corum, I know, say it, because these stories are, they're either in me to tell or they're not in me to tell. I don't ever write for, I don't know, expediency. I have to have some sense of the story and the character needing to be told, and I get that with Elric all the time. I mean, I just announced Elric's my last Elric story, and I'm already making notes for another Elric story. So it's and I don't really think like that with Corum, because it ended very definitive. Well, so did Elric, of course. But it just, to me, the Corum and the Hawkmoons seemed to have natural completions. I didn't really have any more interest in the characters. Elric, I still have a strong interest, and Von Beck, I still have a strong interest in the basic character. So therefore, they have stories, that come about. I mean, at least in my head, if nowhere else, because I'm never going to write all of them. I mean, unless I get an extension, I don't think I'm going to be able to write all of them.
Well, and then thinking of the Eternal Champion and Von Beck, I was just reading that those are being made into, or being developed for a series for.
Well, that's the thing we're currently disputing. It's a Saturday, so my agent isn't really around. I was told to say nothing. I was told that I would be killed and the entire project would be dumped if I uttered a breath of what was going on. And then David comes on in Variety, which isn't exactly an obscure place, and announces it. So what I've done is I've said that I can amplify what David says, but I can't say any more beyond what he's said in Variety. I'll take his lead.
That's totally fair. Plausible deniability of additional material. Totally understand.
So anyway, I can only say read the Variety piece, because that's all I know has been said, and I don't know what else I mean, I'm bursting to talk about it. My wife keeps telling me off, Linda keeps saying, you can't say that, you're not allowed to, and all that.
But we definitely don't want to get you in trouble.
Like that either, so I mean, I'm probably the least protective, self-protected person I know. I just I say anything, and I'm not with. I mean, horribly indiscreet. I mean, I can't be relied on to keep a secret. I'm not because I'm trying to pass it on, because I forget it's a secret. I mean, I'm just not like that. I'm just not very good at keeping secrets, even if they're in my self-interest, I must say. So at the moment, yes, as David has said in Variety, that he and Dana do want to produce it. I've talked to them. I'm very pleased with their ideas. they're very similar to ideas I had when I was asked years ago. I was asked by John Goldstone, who produced the final program, which was a Jerry Cornelius novel, the first Jerry Cornelius novel, and John wanted me to do an Eternal Champion story, so I adapted 2 or 3 Eternal Champion stories into one script, because it's, it's going to be a film. It never went anywhere. I didn't particularly want it to go anywhere, but it was what it, it's what it was. And this isn't that different. I mean, they can, luckily, there are so many ways of entering the Eternal Champion story that they don't have to make any major changes. They just have to select what they want to start the series off with. All I can say is that Elric probably won't be the first one, but it's a series that can go so well because it's the same character going from story to story. And luckily, as I said at the time, John Dacre, the sort of, as it were, Eternal Champion living in our world, or my world of whenever it was I started writing it, was black. I didn't say anything about it. I didn't make a big deal of it because there's no need to make a big deal of it because it didn't count in the story at all. But because of that, it might seem a bit like another Hollywood bit of fashion. At the moment, I don't trust Hollywood very much, and they get fashionable. They start sort of shoehorning really the wrong character, either male, female, whatever, into another character, and it doesn't really work very well because the original resonances get lost that way. So I'm lucky in that with John Dacre, I don't have to worry about much getting lost.
You wrote with the right resonance,
right? And the same with women. I've got female, not too many, but I've got female champions as well. Ilian of Garethorn in whatever the book was called, or the Champion of Garethorn, and others, like Una Person and who don't actually very often appear in those books, but they're there. So I'm really ahead of that, if you know what I mean. We don't have to start changing people's appearances, just because Hollywood is afraid they're going to, not get enough people of Asian descent into a story or whatever it is. I understand the motives, and of course I'm all for the general inclusion, but I don't see any. It often doesn't work very well. I have an example in that one of the previous film developers for Elric, who they were very enthusiastic, but they didn't really know it very well, wanted to change Moonglum into a black girl who's an archer. And if there isn't a kind of stereotypical image now of, in Hollywood of that sort of character, I mean, it was just ridiculous to me. And it was all done, as it were, it's sort of virtue signaling. It doesn't have very much substance. If the person had really originally been a black character with, and all of that in a context where it was important, then obviously it would be all right. But a lot of the time I'm sort of unhappy with that current phase in Hollywood. A little bit cynical about it, actually.
Change for change's sake.
Yeah. I mean, I understand why they want to do it, and it's only fair to want to do it and all the rest of it. But I don't see that it's particularly helped a lot of stuff I've watched. Although I did like Foundation. I saw the beginning of Foundation. I thought it was very good. I love the science fiction that I didn't like in books on television. It's perfect for television. I've watched most of it. I'll watch it all apart from Dune. I'm still a little bit. I found the last Dune was so boring. I love the the David Lynch one, that but of course a lot of people don't. But for me, it's like one great trailer. You know, he doesn't bother to rationalize all this stuff and go on and on about families and this and that, and the way planets work. And that he's cut out the stuff that I like cut out. 2001, I mean, I was a good friend of Arthur Clarke's, and I love Arthur. And we got on very well, but I really couldn't stand 2001. And he was upset because Kubrick had cut out a lot of his realistic stuff, his background stuff. He was in tears at one point about it. And I couldn't tell him that was, I mean, I could have done with a bit more cut out. I just get impatient with rationalizations, I think, certainly but I don't in the new TV stuff that's coming out. I really like it. I've liked all of it. So, well, I haven't seen all of it, but, you know, I've liked most of it. Anyway, yeah. Let's have another question, or I'll just ramble into the dust.
Hey, Mike, I was going to ask, because you mentioned Moonglum, and he's one of my favorite characters. When I read the novels when I was a teenager, you know, I really dug Elric, but I also really liked how Moonglum was a counterpoint to Elric.
Yeah, he's the sort of chorus, is the Greek chorus too.
Yeah, and of course they're very, you know, the arc of Moonglum is very long, but also kind of very much parallels, and you know, he's there at the very end with Elric too. Just kind of curious, like, similar to Elric, like, you know, where did you kind of get inspiration from Moonglum?
He was my best friend, my very best friend and partner, writing partner. Okay. When we worked for Fleetway together, or when we were doing features actually together, called Barry Bailey. He was the great hero of the cyberpunks, who is almost unknown now, but he's a superb writer, tremendous ideas, a great. But he was very short. I mean, he was pretty much so small I could put him in my pocket. And I'm very tall. And I remember going along, you know, those shops that used to have mirrors in them, so you could see yourself as you went by, like a dressmaker's mirrors, I suppose they were, and you got glimpses. I once remember getting a glimpse of myself and Barry, and we were like two different species. I mean, but yes, I mean, Moonglum was very much based on Barry.
Where does the name Moonglum come from? Is that?
Well, it comes from, it's made up.
Okay.
But I would guess the inspiration was Mervyn Peake, who had a lot of names like that.
Got it.
It isn't really typical of the names in Elric. It's much more typical of the names in Mervyn Peake. He's called Tristalune in French, and I rather wish I'd put that in because it looks more exotic in.
It's one of those names that always stuck with me as a reader. It's
yeah.
And we can pronounce it.
Mervyn Peake's full of great names like that. I mean, he's just full of wonderful, almost Dickensian names.
Yeah.
He just had an ear for them. So, and also I think he was in a story before I did Elric. I think I did a book which wasn't published till much later called The Golden Barge. And the picture on the Ace edition, I think it was either Ace or Door, it was one of Don Walheim's companies, because Don liked Barry's stuff and published anything he could get of it. But it almost looks like Barry, except he's got a shock of red hair. I mean, it's big shock of red hair. Barry just had brown hair. But it's actually quite strange to see this cover, which by some chance, it might have been Michael Whelan. I forget who did the cover, but it does look like Barry. And I don't think anybody had really knew it was supposed to be. But that was a different character. Which I used later occasionally. But he was really the origin of Moonglum. And yeah, I like him too. Well, I mean, because Barry was a bit like that too. He was a good Greek chorus. If I got a little too fanciful, or he'd bring it down to earth. Although he himself was probably had the best science fictional mind that I've ever encountered. I mean, he wrote all kinds of stuff, but he was mainly, but the cyberpunks knew him as a science fiction writer. And he could just think of extraordinary ideas. I mean, really, and put them into into some kind of realistic context, such as what would happen if you actually did bore your way through from the surface towards the center of the earth. What would happen? And and he has all sorts of strange things happening in that. It's just well, it might be a novel now, but I think it was a short story when I read it, and it's just strange. I mean, nobody else. I used to call him the Voltaire of British science fiction. He looked a bit like Voltaire, and it was a mixture of the stuff I really like, which is a mixture of metaphysics and modern physics put together, in which the multiverse was, of course, exactly the same thing. And Barry didn't come up with that idea, but I think Barry's inspiration might have helped. I mean, just knowing Barry might have helped me focus and get certain ideas into shape. Yeah. I miss him a lot. He died quite a while back now. We used to do a thing which you can still find on the net somewhere called Old Fart's Fireside Talks, and there weren't many of them because he went and died. But they talk about all of that, how we started, and what we were doing. I recommend them really, just so people could get to know Barry a bit better. He wrote his first published novel was called The Star Virus. It may even have been an ace double. I can't remember, but it was Don did it, and William Burroughs wrote to New Worlds, which done the short story version, and asked if he could use it for his future stories. So Barry had a direct influence on William Burroughs's not The Naked Lunch, because he'd already done that, but one or two of the later books after The Naked Lunch. So and that's how we got to know Burroughs, which is a very strange way of it happening. Anyway, it was Barry Bailey is Moongum, definitely.
We've got another question from the viewers here, and I think it's one that a number of people are kind of wondering. One of our viewers is tried writing, because he works in a different field, but it comes very difficult for him, and was curious if you have any habits or techniques that they can use to develop themselves in that direction. They read a lot of old literature and comics, but they're wondering what habits they might be able to develop to.
The best thing to do, I think, is to write a short story of about 6,000 words. And the best advice I've ever had, apart from the example of Mozart, who also had a similar technique, is Lester Dent's master plot formula. And Lester Dent was the guy who created Doc Savage. And he wrote thousands and thousands of 6,000 word pulp stories. And he produced this, and it's online. It's called Lester Dent's Master Plot Formula, and it shows the tensions. They don't have to be detective stories, of course. I mean, I never use them for detective stories, but he shows how to put the story elements together in 4 parts, and I think it's 4 parts, and it's sort of beginning, middle, end, as it were. The middle is usually longer than the end, but I don't know whether he came up with this or I came up with this, because it's been a long time since I've known this, as it were. But I usually do introduction, in which all of the main characters appear. Development, in which you basically hit, in Lester Dent's master plot form, he says, hit your hero with a heap of trouble. But that's not necessarily what you do, but you produce some kind of, some necessary drama there. And then I do a sort of a prefiguring of the ending, in which I kind of give all the elements of how the ending's going to work out, and then I bring them together at the end. But that's how I started really writing. I mean, that's how I started seriously writing short stories for adults, with basically with a 6,000 word structure, which I then, once I'd got the hang of that, I could then go to a 12,000 word structure, using the same structure, but with more ambitious elements. And then from 12,000, and this is really the truth, it was a very conscious thing I did, from 12,000, 15,000 maybe, to 24,000, which I think was the first published Eternal Champion story. And then 48,000, or actually it was 45, because I split it into 15,000 elements. The Hawkmoon books are all done 15, 15, and 15 per book. And then they echo the overall trilogy, which is 4 books, which essentially the 4th book is the coda in musical terms. I think if you look to music and how, or just read a bit about how what a Mozartian string quartet is like, you can get a very good idea. Should you be musical? Of course, if you're not, it's not so easy. But most people, listen to music, and I have known some tone deaf writers who still manage to make more than a good living.
So you're looking at the musical movements, essentially.
Yes, and how it's brought together, and then you don't have to have, I mean, for me anyway, you don't have to have a necessarily rationalized ending where, like, the detective gets all the people into the room and say, this is what happened, first of all.
It doesn't have to end on a major key. I got it.
It has to, yeah. It has to end on a satisfying note. It has to be resolution. And as a reader, you must feel it's been resolved, and you actually do that with each book in a quartet or a trilogy, and they have to echo whatever musical form. I mean, this is just me. Musical form you're trying to use as your. And I used to play music all the time.
I was going to ask, are you a scholar of music as well?
No, not a bit. I'm self-taught. I'm basically taught by a scholar who was a close friend of mine called Lang Jones, who also wrote some beautiful stories. He was the assistant editor of New Worlds, but he trained as a musician. I mean, he was a concert pianist, and he gave up any ambition to become a concert pianist when he realized that his fingers weren't long enough, his spread wasn't wide enough to capture what he needed to capture in modern music. And he just he could still do it. He played with incredible brio. I mean, he was just astonishing. You just show him a piece of music you'd never seen before, and he'd just attack it, and so I learned. I didn't study music, but I never studied music, even at school. But I was playing music very early, and I just heard a very early demo of mine somebody had rescued, which is pretty dreadful. Actually, not as bad as I thought it was going to be, actually. I hadn't heard it for, 65 years. And they got it restored at Abbey Road, which is a great thrill to them. But the funny thing is that everybody used Abbey Road when I was doing music because it was one of the few good studios in London, in the London area. I mean, there was Majestic, Olympia, a couple of others, and I mean, there weren't any other studios. If you wanted to record, you recorded at Abbey Road or somewhere else. It was only given that kind of legendary feel because the Beatles recorded there, but they couldn't really record anywhere else much, that suited George Martin anyway. And you got full orchestras recording there, doing Muzak. I often wondered how Muzak was produced, and it's produced by working musicians sitting there and playing Muzak. It's a horrible, horrible job. I suppose somebody did have to do it.
you've kind of downplayed your music a bit. I mean, you've played with some
Just a
great
bit.
groups. You've got your own musical project, right? The Deep Fix. And I've been trying to figure out exactly how many instruments you play, because every time I look, I
not
find
that
another
many.
one.
No, well, there aren't any these days except the harmonica, because my fingers, I've got very serious neuropathy, and I can't play any fretted instruments at all. And the piano doesn't come. I've never been a good piano player anyway. But I use a harmonica. All the stuff I'm doing these days is either singing or harmonica or whistling. The last track I did, or last, so whatever you call it, last job I did, the guy asked me to whistle one of the pieces, so I whistled. He said he thought the whistling was better than anything else I'd done. So there you go. Yeah, I can't play anything anymore. I suppose I could play the kazoo, which I'd played in my time. I could play a wind instrument. No, I couldn't even play some of those because I can't hit the notes. My typing's getting bad for the same reason. I'm going to have to start going over to some sort of audio system, I think, eventually.
I think you'll find speech to text very frustrating.
Yes, I think I will. I agree with you. When I've tried it, it hasn't worked for me. I still work mostly in longhand anyway, and I can work in longhand fine, although that's rather hard for other people to read. So, and for me too, I'm cursing myself sometimes when I'm trying to read what I wrote when I'm trying to get it onto a computer. And there are now, I know, systems that will take your handwriting and translate it, but I can't imagine what they do with my handwriting. And and what I'm writing for that.
Hey, if they can work with doctors, they can.
True, absolutely, that is true. If they can, then I'm in. Linda always says I should have been a doctor, just judging by my handwriting. Yeah, Dad was a doctor, and she and I fill notebooks, and then when I come to look at them, I think, what the hell was that? I'm doing my best. I'm getting better pens these days, slightly better, more pens which work better for me. I've always used fountain pens anyway. So but all the books were done just straight onto the typewriter. I mean, that's when I could type. And it is very frustrating now. I mean, it's horrible from going from, as it were, as Linda said, machine gun-like attack to picking things out and having to go back and change it all the time. But at least I'm still working, so I'm not really that frustrated. I'm still trying to find a keyboard that might work better. I've got about 50 keyboards, and I haven't found any of them. I've still got my old ordinary typewriter, and I've still got my Selectric, which I love, the Selectric 2, which was a typewriter that was just perfect. I mean, it had all the right features on it for me. And I've still got the tapes, and I've still got the type heads. So I'm actually hoping that there'll be a sort of all the satellites will fall out of the sky, and I'll have to resort to my Imperial 5060, which is a brand new model made to wartime standards. It has a little stamp on it, so it was made between 1940 and 1945. So. And it's a great typewriter. And I've also looked online. You can get ribbons as well. So I'm all set for the Holocaust.
Oh, and some of us in the chat are just geeking out over this. So yeah.
Well, I've got to ask, in the lead up to this show, there was a question that came up quite often. And while you are not a gamer yourself, there was, historically, there was the whole Dungeons and Dragons inclusion of the Molnibonean mythos and deities and demigods and all of that. Jim Ward, a TSR employee who was part of that project, has insisted all along that there had been permission and that there was some confusion.
There was more than permission. I was enthusiastic about it. I knew Gary, and not very well, but he was the guy I Gary Gygax is the guy I talked to, and and you came to know. And like Fritz Leiber, we both the same. We both said, sure, go ahead. That's all we said. I mean, these are the days before, as I'm experiencing now, about 10,000 lawyers suddenly descend on everything, and you have to rack your memory for something you wrote in 1925 before you were born, and see what the copyright on that, all that stuff. It didn't exist in those days. We were just a bunch of enthusiasts, and I didn't know anything about the games, but I thought, fine, sounds good, go ahead. I did the same with Chaosium, and this is where it went strange. Charlie Crank then sues, or threatens to sue, Gary Gygax over ownership of stuff I'd given them both free. And this happened to Fritz too.
Oh boy.
And I just pulled out of it at that point. I thought, I can't get into this. I let agents deal with it. And Gary pulled out. He volunteered to pull out. I mean, I wouldn't have minded if he'd have carried on. Perfectly happy. I mean, what does it mean to me? It's advertising for my books. I mean, I shouldn't get all possessive about it. And I also like the idea of game playing, role playing games. I don't play any games myself. I'm just not a game sort of person. But I love the idea of it. I wrote a very elaborate game for a company called Origin around just before 2000. They had a very successful game, space game. I've forgotten what it's called now. It's called something like Space Commander or something of that sort. And they were here in Austin. So once they knew I'd moved to Austin, they came to see me and said, write us a game. And I said, I've never written a game before. And they said, well, you're done for computers. I said, I haven't got a computer. And I said, it's all this stuff you've been talking about, I'm afraid doesn't mean anything to me. And they said, you haven't, and there was this quietness, as if you just said something really like, I love Satan in church, or something like that. And they went very, very quiet, and they said, do you mind if we get you one? And I said, no. I said, I don't know anything about computers. I don't know, beyond what a few friends have said, but go ahead. I don't guarantee I'll be able to work it, but so they came around with this latest at the time in all the gadgetry, and put it on my desk and put me in front of it. And they said, well, what do you think? And I said, it's like being given a Rolls Royce. You've never driven a car before. You don't know what to think. I mean, you just, there's all this stuff. But I picked it up so quickly that they said jokingly that, in a couple of days I'd be programming. So I really did take to it. I liked it a lot. And I like gaming. The one thing I do like about gaming particularly is that it demands structure, that you can't make you make a bad movie that falls apart. You can't do that with a game. I mean, it's not a game if you do that. Although I'm sure there are some bad games out there, but I mean, generally speaking, there are actually rules, as it were, to gaming. And so it's very satisfying to write for gaming people, because they know there's got to be a logic to it underlying the whole thing. That you don't just sort of start off thinking, oh, I'll write a book. You have to kind of work out, at least some of us learn to work out how to structure a book. And I get very frustrated with that. I mean, particularly with bad structuring in movies and books. So it was a joy to do. I really loved doing it. Then a company called, big company, mostly did sports videos, bought Origin mostly for its platforms and stuff that they developed, and cancelled the whole thing. And it was a very ambitious. We were doing a movie, a book, and a game all together, and I think that's actually where they probably might have started to lose money because they'd already started to do that with their previous Space Commander, if it was called Space Commander. I've got the reels in there somewhere. It's strange. Anyway, sorry. And then this other game company just scrapped everything that Origin were doing, which, you know, they were doing really interesting stuff, but it wasn't to their taste. They just wanted the mechanics, as it were. So it never came out. The book came out as Silverheart, and I did it with a writer now dead called Storm Constantine, and Storm got sick, and she was going to do a sequel, but didn't manage to get it done, and is now dead, sadly. Very good writer, highly recommended. She was a goth. I mean, I remember being at a science fiction convention, and she and her friends came in. This is in the 1980s, and they were all goths, and it was such a breath of fresh air to see these great, you know, pomp goths coming in and brightening everything up, or rather darkening everything down.
What to say?
Right. But they were all kind of, you know, they had huge hair and just looked magnificent. They're all shy as anything, of course, you know, as people often are, who wear, as it were, armor. But they were very nice people. I enjoyed working with Storm on that. And again, I've lost my thread. What was? I don't want to lose. I don't want to stop. You know, have to stop, and they're not being people.
We're just enjoying the story. It's all good.
You definitely, I think, put to rest any contrary rumors about the use for gaming back in the day.
I was very enthusiastic. So was Fritz, and we both liked the idea a lot. We couldn't see, you know, we were quite happy to have our stuff used. And, you know, there was not a penny changed hands, and neither did we expect it. Unfortunately, we also didn't know how big all this stuff was going to get. It's like, you know, a lot of, you know, there are things now where people complain that, for instance, Walter Simonson's hammer in the comics became Stormbreaker, and people say, "Oh, Walter's, you know, ripping you off." But they were writing comics for a relatively small audience, and it was an in-joke. It wasn't really intending to rip me off or rip anybody off. It was just an in-joke. Walter loved those stories, you know. And
Arkham Asylum and Batman.
Sorry?
Sort of like Arkham Asylum and Batman, the Lovecraft nod.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, you know, I doubt if the comics sold more than what, by that time, about 50,000 a piece. I don't know. I mean, they weren't.
And we're sort of back. My apologies from post Hurricane Florida. We ran into some difficulties there, and unfortunately, we're about out of time. But wanted to see, Mike, if you had any final thoughts for our viewers today.
Well, I mean, keep on doing great games. That's all I'm playing them. I've just got the new Elric, the French Elric figures, because I love little figures. I collect toy soldiers. And really, I only asked to see a set because I wanted the little figures. And you know, all this sort of elaborate stuff that goes with them, a set of cards, you know, all the usual stuff. And I can't remember. Anyway, so you know, I don't game myself, but I am a great games fan, if you know what I mean. And I've always loved the idea of people playing role-playing games. I think it helps socialize people in, you know, at a time when we're sort of facing a lot of stuff that doesn't socialize us.
Well, I would say that gamers are certainly fans of yours as well.
Well,
without a doubt.
That's nice. Well, I hope they enjoy the new one anyway. And I'm sure they'll let me know if they don't.
Do you know when in December that's releasing?
No, I don't. I've only seen the arc. I haven't had any copies yet.
Hopefully in time for your birthday.
Well, I hope so. It'd be nice. Well, I mean, they better be. Otherwise, they've only got a week to sell it before Christmas. I'm not sure Santa will be able to get to everybody before
Well,
the 25th.
before I lose signal again, then we should probably sign off here. Thank you so much for coming out. Hopefully, we can do this again in the future.
I hope so.
Everybody that's
very
with
nice.
Sanctum Reading Room will be covering Roger Zelazny's A Night in Lonesome October.
Oh, good for that.
Mark, David?
Yeah, I think I speak for all of us. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been wonderful
pleasure.
to chat with you, and certainly you're one of my favorite authors from this genre, and a big influence on me when I was a young reader as well.
Thanks, thank you very much. I enjoy talking, as you can tell. So I'd be glad to talk again. I'm sorry if I didn't get everybody's questions too, but maybe we can do that another time too.
Thank you so much, and thank you to your lovely wife Linda for helping us with all this setup.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks to Elena behind the scenes.
Yeah,
for dealing with all this.
Not to mention Lizzie, who's come back and is wanting to know what's going on.
So
right, thank you to all the people who got on the Twitch and asked questions. Appreciate it, and take care, everyone.
Yep.
Everyone have a good night.
Bye.